If you looked in the bulletin, you may be asking yourself the question, how in the world is he going to spin that text into a discussion about parenting? And it's actually a portion of that text that I'm going to spin into a discussion about parenting. Actually, there's a series of lessons, and I say series because I don't know exactly how many by the time I'm done. But there's several lessons that I intend over the next several weeks to share with you out of really verses 9 and 10 of that text that Roger just read for us a moment ago. You recall the scene, right? Paul's been brought up against charges. He gets brought before several different individuals over a period of time. He's before Festus in this particular moment, and it's interesting to note that there's an attitude among Festus in verse 9 that demonstrates that he would rather do a favor to the Jews than to actually do what he knows to be right, according to verse 10. In verse 10, Paul makes the statement back to Festus, as thou very well knowest. Festus, you're doing things contrary to what your intellect and your understanding really ought to be leading you to do. You're making choices and decisions based on the fact that you would like to do the Jews a favor rather than basing your decision-making upon what you really know is right in this particular circumstance. Last week, if you recall, I did a study for young people as they're heading back to school and back to classes and things that they might have to consider and remember as they head back into the classroom, whether it be at the college level or whether it be on an elementary or middle school or high school age level. And today I want to come back and talk to parents. It's only fair, right? We hit the young folks last week. It's only fair maybe that we come back and share a few things that might affect the parents in relationship to these things. So I simply called this Back to School Parent Edition. Let's talk a little bit about some things, that mistakes and challenges that we often make. And the initial slide I said, makes we can make within our families. I actually changed that to mistakes I have made with my family. Because the honest truth is that when I examine these principles, there have been times where I have done the very things that I'm going to encourage us this morning not to do. And that all of us have made mistakes along the path as we're trying to educate and encourage our children. And we sometimes can do things that might be counter to what God would really desire for us to accomplish. And so let's just look at a few of these things together. And this thought of, do I really understand these things, and will I or am I willing to apply these principles rather than maybe do a favor for our children? There's a principle that often is thought of, is that children come first. I'm not opposed to that concept in some levels. I understand that parenting is a sacrificial responsibility. I understand that when you choose to have children and bring them into this world, there's accountability, there's responsibility, and there's going to have to be some sacrifice that is made on behalf of the parents to aid and assist and to nurture the children within that family. There are going to be times where the parent must put himself secondary to the needs and of the children that are within that home. But let me also offer you a thought to consider this morning together, and that is that if children always come first, and I suppose if I took the pen here and I just write, maybe I can, if I just write the word always over top of this, if they always come first, then there's going to be a problem. When they begin to think that they are elevated at all times above all other things, we can create a challenge for ourselves. In fact, we may very well create some very selfish-minded children. In Philippians chapter 2, notice with me verse 3. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3. Notice what Paul writes, and we're going to look at some texts that don't necessarily point directly to parenting or children per se, but they're principles that certainly should govern the home. And in Philippians 2 verse 3, notice, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. And let me suggest to you, if that principle is not instilled in the minds of young children, if that principle of selflessness, if that principle of being willing to look out for the well-being of another or be considerate of the well-being of others, if that's not something that is learned in the home, they most likely will not engage in their other environments in a very positive way either. Paul said, let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. And let me suggest to you that if we repetitively, I'm not saying on occasion that it's not necessary, but I'm saying if we repetitively instill in our children's minds that they must always come first, that they are always the precedent, they are always the most important thing, we're going to raise some young adults who begin to believe that to be true. And they go out into the world and they take the very things that they were taught within the home, that they're the most important thing since sliced bread. I don't even know what that means, by the way, but anyway. Right? You understand the point I'm trying to make. If we want selfless children, or if we want selfless adults, I should say, then we need to be instilling that as parents into our children. If we create selfish children, we'll have selfish adults in the world, and I'm telling you, that is not going to be a very pleasant experience for anyone. If we're always talking about children coming first, then maybe we'll miss this point as well. If they are first, and repetitively so, and we forget to make sure that they understand where God fits in that picture, then what will the end result be? In Matthew chapter 10, Jesus is teaching here. In this account, says, he who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. One of the great disservices that I could do to my children or for my children would be to imply to them that somehow God is secondary within the family circle. One of the great disservices that I could do for my children is to somehow lead them to believe through example or through word or through conduct that somehow God can be somewhere lower on the priority scale than other things. The great service that I can provide to my family is to instill in their minds daily that God will always be first. I may want to do my children a favor, but I'm not doing them any justice if they do not see in our family circle that God must come first. We honor Him first. We love Him first. And that's the implication. Jesus is not saying hate your parents. That's what the world tells teenagers to do. God is not saying hate your parents. God is not saying hate your children. What God is saying is I must be the priority. If you are not willing to love me more, if you are not willing to prioritize me, there will be challenges. But let me also suggest to you that if we will prioritize God, if He is first within the family structure, then all the other relationships will benefit as well. When God is placed in perspective. And so parents, and I'm not wearing steel-toed shoes today. I'm on my feet as much as yours today. But as our children head back to the classroom and they head back to school, and there are going to be all kinds of things that they're going to want to do and be involved in and all those kinds of things. May we always remember that if God must take second place in order for all of these other things to be fulfilled, then we may want to reevaluate. And we may want to reconsider and think about, is there a way that we can make sure that we must make a way that God will be first and all other things secondary to Him. And it's not a matter of loving our children. If we'll love God first, we'll love them in greater ways as well. And let me add this thought as I believe it's important. Choosing the children over the marriage doesn't help the marriage. And I say this because I know it's hard. Because I've got 3 children. So I know it's hard. But we have to be cautious to not wake up one day and look across a kitchen table and wonder who I'm looking at. If we're not spending the time that we need to, even when our children are young, even when they become teenagers, even when our lives are busy, even when there's all kinds of things going on, it is important for the marriage structure to stay solid. It is important for us to remember who we are in a relationship, because we'll not do those children any great service if we have become so focused upon them, that we have become so focused upon what we're providing for them, that we lose the marriage in the process. Notice what verse 18, you remember God's creation and what He said in Genesis 2:18 when He said, "And the Lord God said, it is not good that man should be alone. I will make him a helper comparable or compatible to him." It's important from the very early principles of God to appreciate the benefit that a strong marriage can bring to the family structure. I realize there's challenges at times. I realize there's difficulties at times. I realize sometimes not all parents step up to their responsibilities. But we need to work diligently towards that end. Let's look at another principle. We have to be careful that we don't look at our families as a let's take a vote process. For lack of a better description, can I share with you what I believe the principles of Scripture say about the family structure? God put fathers in charge of the home. And not by elected process either. And not because the family voted him as the one who's in charge. But he has to take authoritative responsibility within the home and the structure of that home. In Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19, notice what is said here. Relationship to Abraham, God says, "For I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he hath spoken to him." It is a mistake if the family structure is confused about who's really in charge. It's a mistake and a challenge to the family structure if there's not an understanding of where real authority lies. And children, may I just burst the bubble for a moment? It doesn't reside with you. And parents, let me burst your bubble. You and I are the reason that they're that way. We've allowed children to be thought of as the decision makers. They're the ones deciding for the family what it should do and how it should function and the purposes it'll fulfill. And that's not at all what God designed. When He looked at Abraham as a great man, one of the things that He said about him was, he will command his household. I don't have to worry about Abraham taking responsibility for his household and accepting the responsibility of that. Let's go into a New Testament text. Look at mothers for a moment. In 1 Timothy chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 13. "And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan." Notice that phrase in the middle of that. That the man, yes, the father is the authoritative figure that God has placed within the family structure. He's placed the fathers on that and given him the responsibility. But friends, He's also given the mother the responsibility to manage that home. And you cannot manage the home without a level of authority, by the way, within that relationship. The mother has a level of authority. If she's going to manage that household, then she has authority within that structure as well. To make sure it is guided and directed and managed in such a way that God would be well pleased. So fathers, accept the authority that God gives you whether you want it or not. Mothers, accept the authority and the responsibility to manage and to guide and direct that household in the path that God would have it to go in. And let's be careful that we're not always taking a vote about how family decisions are made. Children are not capable yet. Many of them, especially when they're extremely young, are not capable yet of the kinds of decisions that families need to make. Fathers and mothers need to accept that responsibility and be the authoritative figures and be the ones making the decisions and choices of the path and the direction that the family should go, and children then should obey. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 1 illustrates that principle for us. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with you and you may live long on the earth. Fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition, or the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And friends, can I suggest to you that part of the problem is we say, well, look at those disobedient children. Look at those rowdy children. Look at those irresponsible children. And may I give a thought in our study this morning that much of that problem is brought on because of those who are leading that house. I'm not saying always. I've seen some rebellious children who chose to be rebellious despite the best efforts that their parents have made. But I've also seen a lot of rebellious households because that's what the parents led it to be. And I'm not trying to just be critical or challenging or hurtful. I'm trying to help illustrate to us the importance of these roles and make sure we understand that the structure of our families and the longevity and benefit of our families are going to be dependent on acceptance of these responsibilities. And that, yes, we accept the responsibility of the fact that a disobedient household or a rebellious household in many ways is just as much a reflection upon my choices at times. So let's be careful that we remember God's structure. Number 3. Sometimes we convince ourselves that children should always have the best. And like any other parent, we all want to at times provide nice things or quality things for our children. But we can also make the mistake if we lead them to believe that prosperity and ease is always a good thing. So go into the book of Deuteronomy for a moment. Deuteronomy chapter 8. I want you to notice a principle that is shared as the Israelites are about to go in and receive the promised land. And here's the commendation that is given to them beginning in verse 7 of Deuteronomy 8. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey. A land in which you will eat bread without scarcity, in which you will lack nothing. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you can dig copper. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which He has given you. Beware that you do not forget the Lord your God by not keeping His commandments, His judgments, and His statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full, and have built beautiful houses, and dwell in them, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold are multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, when your heart is lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness in which were fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty land where there was no water, who brought water for you out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, fathers did not know, that He might humble you and that He might test you to do you good in the end. Then you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gained me this wealth. And you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is He who gives you power to get wealth, that He may establish His covenant, which He swore to your fathers, as it is this day. Friends, you and I need to remember that prosperity and ease can be a temptation. It can lead our children at times to believe that everything is easy, when everything is not always easy. And if we've never ever told them no as they're growing up, if they've never heard the words no, they are going to be crushed the first time they hear it from someone else. I think I'd just as soon get that out of the way on their behalf. I can get that aspect out of the way early on, right? If they learn that from me on occasion. And sometimes they need to hear no, even when I could do what they're asking of me. It's not always about what I can do for them. It sometimes need to be asked, what should I do for them? And sometimes the answer needs to be, not today. So that they can begin to experience and understand from a young age that you don't always receive everything that you want. You don't always receive everything that you ask for. And fathers, can I speak to you for a minute? I can say that to Samuel and Isaac any day of the week. But daughters are hard for dads. And I see some shaking heads. Right? But my daughter needs to know and understand that we can't give everything all of the time. And to learn to appreciate at times some contentment with what we actually have. And to appreciate that prosperity and ease, as they were directed there in those days, can also be a hindrance. Because the temptation is that look how great things there are. Why do I even need God? Why do I need to be concerned about Jesus? Why do I need to even be focused on Him? Prosperity and ease can be a temptation. And the Lamentation writer Jeremiah said that something for nothing can be destructive. We need to appreciate that if there's always just give and no accountability, no responsibility whatsoever, then that can lead to challenges. Lamentations chapter 3, verse... No, you're not going to find verse 27, are you? Good luck looking for that. I'll think of it in 2 minutes when I don't need it. I'll come back to it, because it'll come back to my mind. But maybe. Ask me on the way out. That's when I'll remember it. But we need to be careful that we're not providing, and we need to be careful to proofread charts once in a while too. But we need to be careful that we don't imply to our children that they can have something from nothing. And that mindset can be destructive and challenging to us. And again, I'll find it and make sure that you know it's real later. Let's also talk about this. That there's evil that can come from a lack of restraint. In 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 12. 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 12. Notice he said, "In that day I will perform against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." I want you to focus just for a moment upon that statement when he said that the challenges that he was going to face, that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever, that came because his sons had made themselves vile in verse 13, and he did not restrain them. I said earlier in our study that there's an absolute possibility that you might be doing everything possible in your mind to try to guide that home correctly and lead your children, be a good example, and teach them the things they need to know. And yet there still may be rebellion within them. There still may be some poor choices in relationship to them. But what I appreciate about that is that Eli was given some responsibility that when those sons began to walk those vile paths, to restrain them from doing so. And I thought about that phrase, and exactly what does that mean, that he restrained? And I could mean a lot of things, I suppose. And when you think restraints, does that mean he should have tied them up and forcibly not let them? And I don't know that that's the imagery there. I believe the thought process is that he didn't do anything about it. He didn't say anything about it. He didn't challenge them on it. He didn't try to stop them. He made no effort to try to change the path that they were on. And maybe in one way further, we need to consider this morning is that he may have very well been the facilitator of those things. Sometimes parents, we make the mistake. Our children may be making some poor decisions. And there may be times, especially as they get older, that I cannot physically restrain them from doing so. I cannot be with them 24/7. I'm not going to have the ability to stop them from making those decisions. But I can certainly not pay for it. You understand what I mean? I don't have to facilitate their behaviors. I don't have to provide for them the tools that they want to go and then use for vile and wicked purposes. When I did a study with you some time ago, I'll remind you of this conversation that I once had. I did a study some time ago on social media and the challenges that it presents to families and homes. And I don't know whether you remember this or not, but I shared with you about a dad who talked to me one time. His daughter was in a lot of trouble over social media things. I said, and he said, well, she paid for it. Well, I had all kinds of thoughts in relationship to that, by the way. But this is what I actually said to him. I said, who pays for the service? Well, I do, he said. Cut it off. Well, she'll still have Wi-Fi. Who pays for the Wi-Fi? I do. Cut it off. I don't know how. I'll teach you. Here was the point. I felt like he wanted me to say it's all going to be okay. It'll all work itself out. It's just a phase. Right? It's just a stage. It'll all work itself out. But it wasn't going to work itself out if he didn't put some restraints. If he didn't step up and use some restraints that were well within his power and ability to do. He was right. He was not going, if she was going to choose a wicked path, if she was going to choose behaviors that God would not, he could not forcibly stop her from any and all choices. He's absolutely right. But he absolutely had options to restrain or at least not facilitate her from choosing those directions. That's what parents do. At some point, we have to put the wall up. At some point, we have to use some kind of restraint to say, no, I can't stop you from everything, but I'm not facilitating this. I'm not going to help you make these decisions and choices. Under the guise, well, I want them to experience this, and I want them to experience that, and I want them to have this, and I want them to have that. I get it. I'm a dad. I've got 3 teenage kids. For a couple months yet? 3 teenage. That's a sermon for another time. I get it. I've failed. Just like you have failed at times. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge ourselves to get better, and be more responsible, and take a better approach, and look at things better, and be cautious about the things that we do. And there's plenty of room for all the things that our children want to do in their lives. There's plenty of room for the positive things that are perfectly well within themselves. There's plenty of room for that in their lives. But not at subjecting God to some lower level. Not at teaching them that they're always first. Not at all expense paid. We've got to find ways to accomplish those purposes. And ultimately avoid the concept of never wanting them to experience a disappointment. I'm like you. I'd like to go ahead of my children and kick every stone out of the way before they ever see it. I'm no different than you are. I would love such a utopian childhood for my children where they never experience a moment of disappointment. But it's coming one way or the other, right? A moment of disappointment is coming one way or the other, and it can build some character in them. I'm not saying create disappointment on their behalf, but I am saying we need to go ahead and let them experience some disappointment from time to time. Because this principle is true for them as it is for us. Notice verse 3. And not only that by we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. And sometimes how we overcome disappointment is a much part of building our character as so many other things. And there is so much more that we could talk about. So much more that we could consider together. But let this be enough for today. That we avoid the mistakes and pitfalls that can lead our children to believe the wrong things and see and understand the wrong things. And as they head back to school and we've challenged them to accept some responsibility for themselves as it relates to those things, parents, let's you and I accept some responsibility as well. And the things that we need to be doing to guide and lead our families and our homes, to put the proper structure together as best we can. And I realize sometimes that can feel like a lonely path. And may I just encourage you that if we'll appreciate the principles that God has given and do our very best to apply them into that family structure, we'll be the better for it. And our homes will be the better for it. And we'll not be perfect, neither will our children be. But when God is the center, good things happen. And I invite all of us to consider and remember that. And one note I might add, and I'm second guessing already. Grandparents, because we've got a lot of those, stay out of the way. And I say that with all due respect and love for grandparents. There are times where you've got to step out and be grandma or be grandpa and let that family nucleus be what it's supposed to be. And I know, you want to be in there, and you can be. There's a role for you, an important role for you. But be careful that the family never really gets a sense of where the authoritative structure is, because there's always this extra voice coming into the picture. Now, that wasn't even in the chart. That wasn't right for me to add that. Sorry. You may be here this morning and subject to the gospel in some way. Let me just share this with you as we conclude. There's no greater family than the family of God. And I can make you this promise. It only has one head. It only has one. And that's Jesus the Christ who died for it. And there's an authority that comes from the Father that we must honor and respect. And though we are flawed and sinful and need the mercy and grace of our Creator, the family structure of God's home is perfect. Because it's perfect from the top. And you can be part of that and receive the benefits of being part of His family. If you've never stepped into those promises, as we studied in Mark 16:16, he that believeth and is baptized shall be saved. He that believeth not shall be condemned. We studied that in our Bible study this morning. If we can encourage you to step back into His promises if you've left them. If we could help you in some way today. Encourage you to be part of the most important family, and that is the family of God. Won't you come while we stand, while we sing?